You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Al Hubbard. Speaking of a friend of P.E. McAllister, and we're going to talk about him here in a second. Al has done so many things. He's tremendously successful in the private sector. He has worked in the White House for two separate presidents. He's one of the top education experts and philanthropists here in Indiana and really across the country. He has been incredibly kind to me in my career, both professionally and politically. And I'm just thrilled to get a chance to talk to you. How you doing, Al?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for the invitation.
You're welcome. I just mentioned his name, and it's kind of difficult for me and people who've listened to the Leaders and Legends podcast for the past 3 years. This is our 200th podcast featuring you, but have heard me break a few times when I mentioned P.E.'s name and all that he did. Talk a little bit about how you got to know P.E. McAllister and your friendship with him, because I know from having lunch with him, he thought the absolute world of you.
Well, that's kind. I thought the world of him. You know, he's someone, he was a generation or so older than I, and I wasn't raised here in Indiana. I moved here when I was 29 years old. And soon thereafter, I heard the name P.E. McAllister because he was such a successful business person and a successful civic leader, and really had never met him until I became state party chairman in 1993. And so I called on him to ask him for support. And I immediately liked him. He was truly one of the few Renaissance men or people, women or men, I've ever known. He was so extraordinary, not only his business acumen, his political acumen, but his varied interests, varied knowledge. He was a great student of history, which I know you all had in common. And he just did so many things and was so curious. And he was active till he turned 100. And then he decided to go join his maker. So he was certainly a special person.
He could talk about Indianapolis, P.E. could, in a way that very few other people could. Jim Morris could, Mark Miles could, can right now, and others. He was so proud of how Indianapolis changed from the time that he got here in the 1940s till his passing at 101 in 2019. Did you guys talk about that much? Because I know that he felt he was very high on your political acumen, but when we would sit around and just talk about Indianapolis, his eyes would light up like, this is what can happen when everyone works together.
Oh, we did. And of course, he was he and a few others together worked to create make Marion County into a single governmental entity. And of course, they were very supportive of Dick Lugar, who became the first mayor. I think that's correct. This was prior to my moving to Indianapolis. He became the first mayor of the city county government and was, of course, extraordinarily successful. And then he was succeeded by Bill Hudnut. And, we just had a long series of very successful mayors. And PE was one of the key architects in creating this new form of government that attracted fabulous leaders. So, yeah, he was proud of that. But he was not someone to brag, but he was very proud. He cared a whole lot about our city. He was remarkably generous in terms of not only his political donations, but his charitable donations. And anyway,
he basically saved Garfield Park.
Yeah, there you go. That's right. Yeah, I love Garfield Park.
You mentioned that you are not from Indiana. Where were you born, and how did you matriculate here?
I was born in Jackson, Tennessee, which is about 80 miles northeast of Memphis. So it's a rural community. When I grew up, there seemed to be more cotton gins than gas stations. And I went to high school there, public high school, then to Vanderbilt, and then to Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School. And at Harvard Business School, I met a fellow named Ed Klink, and we became fast friends. And we started talking about going into business together, and he ended up moving to Indianapolis. I moved to Memphis, and he became president of a company and thought he could buy it, and so asked me to quit my job in Memphis, move to Indianapolis, and buy this little company with him. And so I quit my job. I moved to Indianapolis, and the deal fell through. But we decided we would find something else. We were committed to finding something. We just had the passion to be, to run our own business. And meanwhile, I had a blind date with my wife. And
you and Kathy met on a blind date?
We did, right after I moved to Indianapolis. So, yeah, the best thing that ever happened to me, I might add.
That's marrying Kathy, not moving to Indianapolis.
Yeah, well, all of the above, but marrying Kathy was at the top, but of course that wouldn't have happened without moving to Indianapolis. So,
when did you move here?
Thanksgiving, 1976. You probably weren't even born.
I was born in December of 67. So I was 9, but you were here for the blizzard of 78 and a lot of the other big events that happened in the late 70s, early 80s. How did you start to form your opinion about Indianapolis? I mean, Jackson, Tennessee is obviously not a thriving metropolis on the like Nashville or Memphis. And I'm assuming that there's got to be 6,000 places in Tennessee named after Andrew Jackson. There has to be.
Well, you would think so. Yeah.
But what did you think about Indianapolis as it started to grow? Because you got here just as things were exploding.
Well, that's when Jim Morris was head of the Lilly Endowment and Ted Boehm was head of the Sports Corporation. Mm-hmm. I, by the way, was first 10 years I was here, I was totally consumed with trying to get our business off the ground. And so I wasn't involved civically, but I was observing and always had a great interest. And it was remarkable what, we wanted to. They had decided they were going to create the make Indianapolis amateur sports capital of the world, and I think they in fact did that. And it was a remarkable achievement, and obviously couldn't have happened without one, the leaders, and two, the Lilly Endowment. And so it was remarkable to watch. But it was also I loved the leadership, with Dick Lugar. He had left. Bill Hudnut was the mayor when I moved here. And then I think it was Steve Goldsmith right after him. Yeah.
One of the most remarkable podcasts we did was with someone, and actually Mark Miles we were sitting at lunch at the Steer Inn on the east side there at 10th and Emerson.
Oh, yeah.
And which is currently owned by my friend Casey Kerr. We grew up together. And I had talked to Mark, I think, about the podcast, or he'd been on, and we were just chatting about the direction of it. And he said, you have to have David Frick on.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I know him, but I don't know him that well. And he goes, you have to have him on. And he was so right. to me, David Frick, along with PE and probably Jim Morris, are the three most important people in Indianapolis's last 50 years who didn't hold office.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're talking about the leadership of the city at that time, David Frick has to be at the top of the top.
Right. No, he is a remarkable person. And I think he was chief deputy
Mayor
there under Hudnut. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So,
and the thing that Mark told the story was about how when Indianapolis was negotiating to bring the Colts here, the fact that David Frick went to Harvard Law School made a difference, because all these East Coast lawyers treated David as an equal as opposed to then just an Indiana Hoosier. So I guess I got to ask, since you're a graduate of Harvard Law School, is that how you treat people from Indiana? Just like, hey, where'd you go? We haven't heard of you before.
Hardly. And, I've never practiced law, and I did pass the Tennessee bar, fortunately. But anyway, I know lots of very, very smart people who went to many different law schools, including I used both the McKinney School and Mickey Maurer School.
My son graduates from Purdue this semester and starts at the McKinney School of Law in the fall.
Well, congratulations. That's terrific.
Well, I laughed and told him, and he had to have a letter of recommendation and asked me to be helpful. And so the letter I was able to procure came from Jim Voiles.
Oh, good.
And I said, Andrew, if this doesn't get you in, you don't have a chance in hell.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm sure you did very well at Purdue. So
he did. He enjoyed it. And, it leads me right into the next person I want to ask you about, of course, and that's Mitch Daniels. The big news this week is that he decided not to run for the Senate. He was a remarkable governor and a remarkable university president. I have to thank, he's come on the podcast twice, and I have to thank him for not raising tuition once in the 4 years my son was there. How did you meet Mitch Daniels, and what did you think of him as governor and his foray into higher education?
I was telling Mitch this. I don't know if I'm sure he remembered when we met. It was in 1973, believe it or not. Yeah, 50 years ago. And what made me think about it is Jim Banks called me to support him. And I said, I've known Mitch for 50 years. I did the calculation. And obviously, I'm going to be with Mitch if he runs. And so I met him because I was dating a girl. You'll know the last name. Her name is Chris Servas. Her dad was Bert Servas. Mm-hmm. And she was going to Wellesley, and I was at Harvard, and I came home to visit, and she got involved in the Lugar buy campaign of
1974.
1974. Yeah. Of 1974. And so I met Mitch through her and that campaign. So there you go. And Mitch was right out of, he graduated from Princeton in 72. So he was creating the ads. I mean, he's remarkable. His intelligence, his IQ just is off the charts.
So how long after 73 did you see him again and say, hey, we know each other?
Well, what happened? Let's see. So I ended up moving here in late 76. And I remember I contacted Mitch. Lugar had just defeated Vance Hartke, and so was going to the Senate, and Mitch was going with him. We had lunch. I said, so Mitch, who should I look up since you're not going to be around for me, to socialize with? And he said, Mark Miles, that's who you should look up. So, but I already knew Mark Miles. But anyway, that's I'll remember that.
How did you meet Mark? Because when he came on the podcast, Mark went to North Central, as did Deborah Daniels and Mitch Daniels, but Mark's younger than Mitch. But he told me that he got involved in the 74 campaign because Deborah Daniels says, hey, my brother's running this campaign. You should do something. I think Mark was still at Wabash at the time.
Yeah, he took some time off, and so he worked on that campaign. My girlfriend worked on that campaign, and that's how I got to know Mark.
To me, Mark Miles is the most impressive leader I've ever met in terms of, if you've got a big giant project and you need someone to run the whole damn thing, choose Mark Miles.
Yeah, well, he's successfully done that a number of times with the Pan Am Games and with the Super Bowl, and obviously what he's done with the Indianapolis 500 and IndyCar. So, no, he's a remarkably talented person. And what he did with ATP, the Association of Tennis Professionals, which he ran for 15 years.
You know, I've told him, I said, you're probably one of the few people who's ever negotiated with Roger Penske, Jerry Jones, John McEnroe, and Fidel Castro.
There you go. That's true.
Did he? Oh, absolutely. Did he?
Great story when he went to Cuba to saw Castro.
I know. Wasn't Castro? Am I remembering correctly? Wasn't Castro in his pajamas? It was like 2 a.m. or something like that.
It was like 2 a.m. I can't remember if it was the pajamas or whatever, but
or maybe Castro just wore his fatigues 24/7.
I don't know.
Do you think of Indiana in terms of, you got here in 76 and you know, we had Bob Orr and Otis Bowen and a lot of other significant leaders, Evan Bayh even, but that Indiana post Mitch Daniels is considerably different than it was pre Mitch Daniels.
You mean that Mitch had such an impact?
Yeah, from a business perspective and a perception.
Well, I think he definitely had an impact. He made it a much friendlier place for business. He reduced taxes. He reduced regulations. He introduced vouchers for education, vouchers to give kids choice, and that's been expanded 2 or 3 times since then. So, he was a remarkable leader with a great vision, and I wish he'd run for governor again. But obviously he decided not to do that, and then thought seriously about running for the Senate, and ultimately, as announced yesterday, decided that wasn't right for him either.
Did his decision surprise you?
Oh,
not to run?
Well, I've been in touch we've been talking along the way. So from the get-go, he said it's something he was going to seriously consider, but he was concerned whether he would how effective he could be, and whether that's the way he wanted to spend the next 8 years, 2 years running and 6 years in office. He said, I'd run for one term only, and focus on 3 things. One, dealing with the deficit and the unsustainable situation with entitlements, Social Security and Medicare, and the fact that is going to subject low-income people to running out of money. Number 2 is, and of course, the huge deficit is just a ticking time bomb for our country and our economy. Then deal with the whole China situation and deal with, basically work to bring both sides together. Now, in his statement he put out yesterday, he also added that he would have wanted to have worked on immigration, which I think, I've talked about that, and, immigration needs to be fixed, and it shouldn't be that hard. You gotta seal the southern border so you don't have illegals coming across. You got to give the dreamers an opportunity to become citizens. You got to give those who are already here an opportunity to become legal. And then we need to reform our legal immigration system to attract the best and the brightest, because immigrants have a giant impact on our economy and our country. I think I read a statistic that 30% of the Forbes 400 are immigrants. It's just amazing. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Mitch would have been fabulous, and I'm disappointed he's not doing it, but I understand.
We try to keep things relatively light here on the Leaders and Legends podcast, and we're talking with Al Hubbard. As I mentioned to you in my pitch, I bill my podcast, I brand it as informative, entertaining, and comfortable. But you brought up the Republican Party. You've been involved for multiple decades. One of the reasons it seemed that Mitch Daniels was going to run for Senate, and obviously I'm not speaking for him, is that he would bring perhaps a Reagan-esque quality, since that's more of his generation, and he worked for President Reagan. What do you see as the future of the Republican Party nationally and in Indiana? Because, I mean, I've been held, as you know, and probably through your grace, held several positions in the Republican Party. Do you see problems ahead or opportunities or both?
Well, I'm not a Trump fan. I think his policies during his 4 years were outstanding, very positive, but his rhetoric and his whole approach to life is it's not what we need in our leaders. So at the same time, he recognized that there's a big portion of our society who feel like they've been left out, that these are the people, the 55% of Americans who have no post-secondary degrees, no degrees after high school. So their wages are $15, $20, $25 an hour. And they feel like trade and immigration has robbed them of their standard of living. And Donald Trump understood that. I hope we, on the Republican side, have a leader who's going to come along and will understand this group of people and will appeal to them and work for them to feel like they do have a future, they can improve their standard of living, and that, but it's not Donald Trump. So if we find the right leader, our party will thrive, because the Democratic Party is just they're out of touch. They are so left wing. They're socialists. They don't believe in capitalism. They think everything should be regulated. They think the federal government should control everything, and they think that left wing liberal social policy is what the American people want, and that is not what the American people want.
And that's one of the reasons why so many people, I thought, wanted Mitch Daniels to run for president in 2012. And I think he said at the time he thought he would win the nomination and then lose to then President Obama, and wanted Mitch Daniels to run for the Senate to bring the sort of core conservative Republican values back to Washington, D.C. that have been not corrupted, but certainly have been some of the sheen taken off of it. I always say, when asked about President Trump, I said he never learned the value of silence. And if he had paid attention and studied Ronald Reagan, he would have learned it, because no one was better at just being, "Oh, shucks, shrug your shoulders. Don't ask me about them. Ask them about them," as Ronald Reagan was. And I wish that he had had more of that quality.
Well, he just didn't treat people well. And that he didn't have parents that taught him to show respect for everyone and to tell the truth. I mean, I'm sorry, it's just that doesn't work for our leaders. And so he has loyalty to no one other than himself and his family. So but I agree with you. Mitch would have appealed to the Trump base as well as traditional free market Republicans, and that's what we need. And unfortunately, it's not going to be Mitch Daniels. But hey, we got a great stable of candidates for president. It looks like Governor Haley is going to announce
Nikki Haley,
Nikki Haley, and DeSantis has been an incredibly effective both governor and politician. He won by 19 points in Florida for governor to get reelected. I'm a big fan of Mike Pompeo. I'm reading his book right now, which is quite impressive. A huge fan of Tim Scott, African-American senator from South Carolina. We've got some great people running. And so I'm very hopeful that one of them, other than Trump, will get the nom. I'd be happy with any of the above, the ones I've just mentioned.
Well, we have obviously a connection to the Trump administration, and that is the Vice President, Mike Pence. How long have you known him? Were you able to stay in touch with him much during his time as Vice President? You're one of the few Hoosiers who's actually worked in a top position at the White House and could kind of explain or know what the operation was all about.
Well, I met Mike when he ran the second time for Congress. This was 19. I get confused. I think it was 1988 or somewhere around there. And we've been friends ever since. I used to go on his radio program, and obviously was very supportive when he ran. Well, I was supportive when he ran for Congress, supportive when he ran for governor, and I think he did an excellent job as vice president, and I was certainly glad he was there. I know it had to be difficult at times, and I was relieved when he stood up to President Trump and did the right thing on January 6th. And did what the Constitution called for, which was to accept the votes from the states, and which meant the election of President Biden. So, and we've stayed in touch, but we're not tight. But he's a very busy man, and he's another one who is very seriously thinking about running for president.
We've been talking a lot about politics. What was your first political memory?
Oh my! Well, I remember this. This will test but knowing you know history so well. So in the sixth grade, Mrs. Noel, this public schools in Jackson, Tennessee, we had a mock UN, and I played Nikita Khrushchev.
Did you bang your shoe?
I took my shoe off and banged it, and from that point on, I've been interested in current events and politics. So that's sort of what that mock UN had a huge impact on me.
What? I'm sure all your friends would. Well, the next time you throw a party at your house, take your shoe off and bang it on there.
That's right.
I like to ask people. I've asked Evan Bayh, and obviously his answer was predictable. But Bart Peterson and others, what made you become a conservative Republican or a liberal Democrat, or however you want to describe yourself? You grew up in the Eisenhower years, which quickly became the Kennedy years. Went through the civil rights movement, Vietnam, all that in college. What made you become a Republican? And were there times where you, maybe in August of 1974, when Nixon's getting on the helicopter, did you question, is this really the right party for me?
Well, the first presidential election I was able to vote in was 1968, and I voted for Hubert Humphrey. And then the second one was 1972, and I voted for George McGovern. And then in 1976, I supported Jimmy Carter. And then in 1980, I supported Ronald Reagan. Now, what happened between 76 and
I want to know what happened between 72 and 80.
I started my own business and came to appreciate the importance of the free market and capitalism and low taxes and low regulations. And so it was a wake-up call to recognizing that the Republican approach of, encouraging people to take responsibility for themselves, giving them the opportunity to create their, very successful livelihood, letting them decide how to spend the money they make, not the government deciding how to spend the money they make, and reducing regulations so it's easier to start new businesses. Those are the things that very much attracted me. And I think I'm I'm pretty much a libertarian with some exceptions. So,
my buddy Chris Spangle's loving to hear that. Were you at all, 50 years ago, if a Republican asked you if you were born in a barn, it was an insult. These days, it's more like a candidate recruitment pitch.
that's exactly right.
Do you think that's a good direction for the Republican Party to move?
So what do you mean by?
In other words, we were seen as the party of the Chamber of Commerce and that sort of thing. And then even in National Review and other smart publications, there's a lot of positing and discussion about, can the Republican Party become the party of the working man and the working woman, the working families? Do you think it can? And do you think that's a natural role for us, given your earlier comments about the Democratic Party, in your view, being out of touch?
I think for sure we can. I mean, Ronald Reagan. I mean, you remember the Reagan Democrats? Those were working class folks who supported Ronald Reagan, and it's because I think we as a party we believe in freedom. I mean, it's a fundamental premise and fundamental principle of government, and as number one, like we believe that people should be able to choose where their kids go to school. Which is critical, as opposed to forcing them to go to failing traditional public schools. We believe in people being able to choose their own doctor, choose where they live, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we believe in providing opportunities for all Americans, and particularly those from the working class or from low income families. So, yeah, I feel very, I mean, I'm proud of the Republican Party because we do appeal to the working class as well as the entrepreneurial class. I think we're less of a party of big corporations. And I think that's just fine, because I think big corporations and the leadership of big corporations, they sort of fit with the Democrat Party. They want the government to be helping them, providing them with subsidies. They want to support the left-wing social agenda. They're so afraid of offending, maybe if they have 10,000 employees or 100,000 employees, they might offend a few of them because they don't want to, because they're willing to support the woke policies of the Democratic Party in order not to offend a very small minority of their employees. So I think we're no longer the party of big corporations. We're the party of small companies, entrepreneurs, hardworking Americans. And we also believe, by the way, we believe people should take responsibility for themselves. It's not the role of government to hand out to support people. We believe in giving people opportunities and let them support themselves and grow and be responsible for themselves.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest on the podcast is entrepreneur Al Hubbard. Is there a particular Hoosier leader and or legend you admire most?
Oh my, there's so many I admire.
Have at it.
Very long list. I think I'd put Bob Orr up there. He was sort of the first politician I met because my future wife was working for him. And he was such a believer in entrepreneurism. He was such a believer in international trade. He was someone who was a doer who wanted to solve problems for Hoosiers. And he was the kindest person. He really cared about the people who worked for him forever. And So he was a remarkable person. But his lieutenant governor, whom people don't talk about anymore, he's still living and doing well, but in his mid-80s, John Mutz, he was a great political leader, and he would have been a great governor. And I'm sorry he wasn't elected in 1988. So we've had, obviously Mitch Daniels. We've talked about him. He is one of the great governors of all time in our country. And he was remarkable at Purdue, freezing tuition for 11 years, which in real dollars meant there was a 25% cut in tuition at Purdue. Now that's a remarkable
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. As a tuition payer, you can very much appreciate that. So, Bill Hudnut was phenomenal. Steve Goldsmith, I think he was one of our greatest mayors, and I'm so sorry he didn't get elected governor. And when was it? 2000? No, 1996. Dave McIntosh ran in 2000. So, anyway, we've been very fortunate in our state.
We had John Mutz as a guest on the podcast. He was one of our very first guests. He came on with his friend Louis Mahern. And
how fun. That was fun.
It was fun. I'm enjoying I've done several where a Democrat and a Republican come on together. And that's included Mike McDaniel coming on with Robin Winston, your friends, obviously. John Dillon, Toby McClamrack have come on together. Jim Kittle, who I know is one of your closest, he came on with Ed Tracy. That was the beginning of the expletive deleted portion of the Leaders and Legends podcast. But we actually also did a podcast, and I don't know if you're a listener, but I can send it to you, on the governorship of Bob Orr, and had Darlene Sherman, Bob Grand, and Mark Lubbers on as well, with Jim Shella co-hosting. I'll send that to you. It was a great discussion. Mr. Lubbers started out things with a bang. That's all I can tell you.
Oh, good. Well, he's quite entertaining.
So why did you decide, going back to school a little bit, to get both an MBA from Harvard and a law degree from Harvard? I knew you had an MBA from there, but I didn't know you had a law degree from there until your incredibly wonderful executive assistant, Jennifer Richardson, sent me your bio. What was the point of, I'm not criticizing you, obviously. I'm in awe of it a little bit. What was the point of doing both?
Well, I actually graduated from Vanderbilt as a pre-med chemistry major, and even took the med cats, had the applications, and decided at the last minute not to apply. And then, I discovered that Harvard had both this new program called the MBA JD program, which was 4 years as opposed to 3 and 2. And I applied and got in. I was shocked. And so it was the second class. Mitt Romney was in the third class, right after the class I was in. And, I just thought it would hopefully prepare me to be successful. And I actually, most people say they did not like law school. I loved law school. I just thought, I enjoyed learning about the law. I think it's fascinating. I love reading about Supreme Court cases now. And I've become very close friends with Mike Ludig, who's gotten a lot of press recently. He's a neighbor out in Vail, Colorado. And, it's so fun talking to him about all these legal issues that we're facing right now, from, abortion to, the role of agencies and versus the Congress versus the executive branch, et cetera.
I remember asking David Frick, who graduated from Harvard Law School, if he had any quote unquote famous or well-known people in his class. And I think he said, I know the name is correct, but I may get the chronology wrong, that former Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer was a year or two behind him at Harvard.
Actually, he may have taken Breyer's older than David.
Yeah, so he may have been a little bit older.
Yeah, I took 2 classes from Breyer, actually, and house sat for him. So, and we remained friends.
Oh, really? I didn't know. Oh, really? So you knew him that well?
Yeah, we went out to dinner with him several times when I was working in the Bush 43 White House, and he's a delightful guy. I mean, it's funny talking to him. He's very open. He's very smart, obviously. And he and Scalia were best of buddies. And he said, Gino, is that how do you pronounce? What's his first name?
Antonin Scalia.
Yeah. But what'd they call him? There was his nickname.
He did have a nickname, and I can't think of it,
or something like that. He said, Gino and I just differ about how to interpret the Constitution. He said, Scalia believes that the way it was written 230 years ago is the way it was written, and everything should be based on the way it was written 230 years ago. I believe that it's a living Constitution, and we should adapt it to current, the current society. Mm-hmm. And so that's our big disagreement. And I thought it was really quite interesting that, there was neither side's covering up what they're doing. They just have a different philosophy. And he, by the way, Chuck Schumer was in my class.
You stay in touch with him?
No.
All these friends of yours we'd love to have on the podcast.
Yeah.
I remember we did a pod, and I knew this because I got to be friends with him through Bill Bloomquist. And I think Bill Bloomquist, the professor, used to be Dean of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. He was my mentor over there on the political science side. But through him, I got to be very good friends. Well, I don't want to overstate it. I got to be friends and hung out quite a bit with Andy Jacobs.
Oh, yeah.
Who I just thought the world of. And we did a podcast on him, actually. His wife came on. I
actually had enormous respect for Andy Jacobs, too.
Terrific.
I actually voted for him one time.
He's the first person I voted for when I got a chance to vote.
Oh, that's great.
Was Andy Jacobs, because my mother was in the Marine Corps, and my mother worshipped Andy Jacobs, worshipped him. Yeah. But he talked about when he was running against Hudnut, or Hudnut was running against him in 72 and 74 for the congressional seat, how they would ride to the debates together. And one of the things that I try to do in this podcast when I put the Republican and the Democrat on together, and that's always a lot of fun, great conversation, is to show that still exists, that so much of what you read about how people don't get along is true, but the vast majority of it, in my view, is not true. And the more people get involved in politics, the more they will realize that. Is my hypothesis wrong, or please critique it?
Well, I guess I agree with you when it comes to Indiana and disagree with you when it comes to Washington, D.C. I mean, in Indiana, again, I don't sense animosity between Republicans and Democrats. I mean, we're friends, and we're willing to disagree with each other, but not in a disagreeable way. And we respect each other. And there's not the sort of, I don't know, bitterness or, the
animus.
Animus, yeah, that's a better word. The animus that exists in D.C. Now, in D.C., it's a no holds barred kind of political environment, which is just inappropriate. And I'll tell you something that happened, and this was one of the biggest disappointments I've had recently, is the Club for Growth, the ad they ran against Mitch Daniels 2 weeks ago. It was a very Washington thing to do. Dave McIntosh, who is a Hoosier and whom I used to work very closely with, was responsible for it, and it's indefensible. And it's not the way we operate here in Indiana, and I'm sorry. It was offensive, it was inaccurate, and it was inappropriate. And that's what. And David I think he's lost his way and lost his principles, and all he wants to do is pander to his donors and his desire to get publicity.
It was shocking, and I would have loved to have had a chance to. I write a monthly column for the Star, And I would love to have had an opportunity to take that ad on big academia. I don't even know what the hell that meant. I'm like, Mitch Daniels has saved me tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. Come on. Yeah.
You were Indiana State Party chairman, and you were Indiana State Party chairman at a very good time for Hoosier Republicans and Republicans throughout the country, 1994. What made you decide to take that role on, A, and B, did you ever think that you would put your name on the ballot?
Well, I certainly thought about it. I worked for Bush 41, and then we lost in 92. And so we came home in 93. I still had the political bug in my system. And so decided to run for state party chairman. Rex had been state party chair for 2 years. And so I ended up succeeding him. And, I thought about running for governor, but I don't know. I'm glad I didn't. I think I would have been I think I would have been a successful governor if I could have gotten elected governor, but I'd have to get elected first. And I would have been running against Evan Bayh. There's no way I would have beaten Evan Bayh. I wanted to have, the reason I'm attracted to politics is to try to make the world a little better place, or try to make Indiana a little better place. And so, our focus for the 94 campaign was to elect people who believed in free markets and low regulations, low taxes, et cetera, school choice. And so that's why I did it. That's why I considered running. I didn't get close. It's just something
Sure.
I had brief discussions with a couple of people about running for governor, and that was it.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast with entrepreneur and political leader Al Hubbard. Did you have much of a relationship with Rex? I wrote a that's not right. A tribute to him in the Indianapolis Star based on my interaction with him. I could tell you that he influenced me in the sense that sometimes you can't pull your punches. You just got to say what you got to say. And I just am interested, you guys had significantly different backgrounds. And how did you get along, especially when you were both more active in the party several years ago?
Well, I'm sorry to report, in 96, he ran for governor, and Steve Goldsmith ran for governor. And I supported Steve Goldsmith, and Rex considered that disloyal to him and inappropriate. And to be perfectly frank, he never got over it. So we did not have, we had a very good relationship prior to that. And he was very helpful when I was state chairman. I thought he did a great job as state chairman. And I was sorry that happened, but it unfortunately did.
And that happens in politics in the sense that I remember talking to the late Matt Tully one time about, we were having lunch or whatever, and he had written a column about Republicans and Democrats not being able to get along. And this was 20 years ago or so. And I said, if you want to see real feuds, blood feuds that never go away, those are within parties. They're not between members of the other parties. Is that your experience too?
Yes. Another person with whom I lost a relationship is Dan Quayle, because in 2000, I supported George Bush for president, and he was very upset that I didn't support him for president. And he essentially severed our relationship. So we have not had any contact since then.
You mentioned your time at Harvard, and it's pretty famous that you had a classmate at the Harvard Business School. Forgive and correct me if I'm getting this history wrong. And that person was then George W. Bush before he became 43. How did you get to meet George W. Bush, and how did that affect your sense of both business and political career or political activity?
Well, I met George right after, and I don't call him George anymore.
Well, that takes me, we're both smiling because you probably wouldn't remember this, but when I was leaving Mayor Ballard's office, you were very kind. We had lunch at Palomino.
Right.
And I was trying to figure out what to do to start my own company or whatever. And I ended up doing it. through people like you and Michael Connor and Brian Sullivan and others who encouraged me. But I asked you at that lunch, when was the last time you called George W. Bush George? And you said on election day, before Florida was decided.
Yeah, there you go. But anyway, I met him right when he came to. My roommate was from Houston and knew George. And so when George came to Harvard Business School, he came over we were house sitting at the time, and he came over and we became fast friends. I mean, we weren't best of friends, but we were good friends, and we would see each other every couple of weeks, go to dinner, or he'd come over to our house and we would party. And he drank back then. He quit drinking at 40 years old, but he did not drink any more than the rest of us. It wasn't like he had a drinking problem. We dated we dated the same girls occasionally, and he didn't know what he wanted to do. And it's interesting that he ended up going to Midland and really sort of following in his father's footsteps. And then so we stayed in touch, but we weren't, again, super tight. And then when you'll love this story. This is actually one of my favorite stories. So I decided, I was fortunate to be asked in 1986 to be campaign manager it was really 87, the beginning of 87, to be campaign manager for Pete DuPont, who was a former governor of Delaware, running for president against George H.W. Bush, Jack Kemp, Alexander Haig, and Pat Roberts.
Bob Dole.
Yeah, Bob Dole.
DuPont had all kinds of ideas.
Yeah, great ideas. And the second day on the job, we moved to Wilmington, Delaware. I get a call, and anyway, I said, Al Hubbard here. He says, Hubs. I said, George, is that you? And he said, yeah. And he said, I'm mad at you because I understand you're working against my dad. And I said, I stopped because I hadn't thought about it that way. I said, well, George, I guess I hadn't thought about it that way. I'm working for Pete DuPont. And George said, and this is so George Bush, he said, Hubs, we're going to bury you. And when we do, I'm going to get your ass down here to help Dad get elected president of the United States. And so 14 months later, Pete DuPont, after New Hampshire, he withdraws, and George Bush calls me the next day and asks me to come down and work on the campaign. So,
did he remind you of the previous conversation?
No, he didn't have to. He said, all right, I told you, we need you down here.
And what was that experience like? I read the Jack Germond book on the 1988 campaign. And I'm trying to think, and Jules Wickover, I was trying to think of his partner. Yeah. That's a great book if you haven't read it. Have you read it?
I have, but a long time ago, obviously.
It was interesting partly because of the description of Mitch Daniels being backstage at the vice presidential debate and his reaction when Quayle compared himself to John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And they have him in the book, quote him in the book saying, God damn it, we told him not to say that.
Oh, my goodness. I did not know that. I had forgotten that.
Well, the thing is, I had just interviewed Governor Daniels for the podcast the first time, and I hadn't gotten to that part of the book yet. I was reading it, but I hadn't gotten to that part of it. And then Mark Miles, he can tell stories as well because Mark Miles ran Quayle's campaign in 1980, which beat Birch Bayh. How did you end up working for Bush Sr.? And do you have some impressions of the man? Because to me, he seems like one of the most genuine Americans that ever lived. Who ever lived?
Yeah, he was a true American hero. Well, you start by the fact he volunteered and left Yale for World War II, flew fighter planes off aircraft carriers, gets shot down, is saved, and then they ask him to go back to go back to the States, and he said, "No, I'm not going to go back to the States. I'm going back to my ship." And that was the kind of person he was. And then I think what was most remarkable, I mean, if you look at his presidency, and I wasn't involved, I was on the economic side, so I wasn't involved at all in this, but what he did, the way he managed the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Eastern Europe and the assimilation of those countries into the particularly East Germany and West Germany and all those countries, basically promoting freedom and democracy, et cetera. And he did it in a way where there was not one shot fired. He did not take credit for any of it. And it was a remarkable achievement. And, he was an amazing person. He was, his mom taught him to never say I, always say we. And he was just a gentleman through and through. I remember in 1992 when we were in trouble, and they brought Peggy Noonan down to write his State of the Union address. And I knew Peggy, and I said, "So Peggy, how's it going?" And Peggy said, we want him to say I to take credit for what he's accomplished. And it's just very hard because his mom preached and preached and preached. It's we, not I.
Yeah. President Bush called it the great I am.
Yeah. Oh, the great I am.
The great I am.
Yeah. That's great.
He loses in 92, and then 2 years later, I believe it's 94, George W. Bush is elected governor.
Right.
Where you were talking just a few minutes ago about he wasn't sure what he wanted to do. Did his run for governor and then subsequent run for president surprise you? And were you involved?
Well, in 1990, he asked me if he should run for governor, and I not that I had any influence, but I told him I didn't think so with his dad as president. But anyway, he didn't run. Then he runs in 94 against Ann Richards. I remember watching the debate, and everyone thought Jeb would win and George would lose, and the opposite happened. And then in 97, he asked Kath and me to come down and spend the night at the governor's mansion and to talk. And we talked about his running for president. And so I got involved in that campaign. I was very, very active in that campaign, basically putting together briefings on the major policy issues that a president faces. And it was a great experience for me. I mean, I was the organizer, and we brought in people like George Shultz and Condi Rice and Bob Zellick in the international sphere. And then for economics, Marty Feldstein and John Taylor and John Cogan and Glenn Hubbard. And so, it was just and it shows you the kind of person George Bush is. He said to me, he said, I feel like I know the state issues, but I don't know the national and international issues. And I need you to help me. You need to put together briefings for me on all the major issues. And so that's what I did. And it was a great experience.
What was it like as George W. Bush's friend? What was it like to sweat out the Florida debacle?
Oh, yeah. It was, I remember talking to him during that. And, it was one hell of a battle. It was one hell of a battle.
Did you ever get this?
But I will say this, because I've never been an Al Gore fan. He and I we literally clashed big time in Bush 41. But the way he handled that is truly remarkable. Truly remarkable.
And I'd agree with that, especially as it relates to the next thing I was going to ask you about, and that is, what was it like? This is a question I asked Mitch Daniels, and he was interesting because I think his answer was, no one's ever really asked me this before. And he started to talk about that day. But what was it like on 9/11 for you?
Well, I wasn't in the administration. I was asked to join the administration, but it just didn't work with our kids. They were in junior high and high school. So, I meant it more in terms of forgive me, I should have finished the question this way. In terms of knowing the man who just had all of this responsibility of this tragedy and everything that came after it thrust upon his shoulders. I thought he was remarkable. I mean, to be honest, I'll never forget him in New York City, standing up, getting that bullhorn and talking to the firemen and everyone around him and talking about America. I mean, Bush really, you'd have to say that it was a remarkable how what a great leader he was after 9/11, and how he really helped the country grapple with that. I mean, being invaded. I mean, it's well, I guess we had obviously Pearl Harbor, but at that time Hawaii wasn't a state. But to have to be attacked like that, I guess hadn't happened since you're the historian, since the British did it in 1812 or something.
Yeah, since they burnt the White House.
Yeah.
Have you ever watched the video? And it's incredibly popular on YouTube. I mean, millions of views. Or talk to President Bush about when he threw out the ceremonial first pitch that night at Yankee Stadium after 9/11 during the World Series.
I've actually not talked to him about it, but I have watched the video. It's remarkable. It is so special. Yeah.
I have a guy who I haven't seen in a long time. His name is Jerry Turner. He's a captain. He's a pilot. But in a previous incarnation, Mr. Turner was a frat brother of Mr. Greg Ballard.
Oh, wow.
And I would see Jerry when I would play racquetball and I was working, for the mayor, and he would laugh sometimes, goes, I just can't believe the guy who could barely get up after, some party at the frat house is the mayor of 1 million people.
Yeah.
And so with not necessarily putting it in those terms, were there times where you were like, man, the guy who used to come and just hang out at the couch at the house is now the president of the United States?
Yeah, he truly didn't know what to do with his life, and he wasn't highly motivated when I first got to know him. But by the time he got to be president, he was the most disciplined person. Every meeting started early. He would thoroughly study the materials we would provide for him. He asked great questions. I mean, he was a different person, and so it was amazing. At the same time, he's always been irreverent, loves to joke around. Just cannot not find something humorous in whatever's going on. I mean, he's amazing.
Did you ever get a chance to have a decent conversation or a fun conversation with his mother, Barbara Bush?
One time, this is in Bush 41. This is when George was George. He had me come over. And we were on the second floor where the president lives, and Mrs. Bush was there, and we talked, and, she was, but I mean, not extensively, but, it was the only time I really had one-on-one contact with her. Although I did have, now that I think about it, a few years before H.W. passed away, I saw Mrs. Bush and asked her about her husband, and I mean, she was a pistol. She was a pistol. No, and that's where Bush gets his, that edge to him.
He always said, what'd he say? I have my dad's face in my mama's mouth.
Yeah. That's very good.
We have just a few minutes left with Al Hubbard before we ask him the 5 questions we ask everyone else. And you know what? I need to say this because I just love him to death. I've asked you about all these amazing people: Mitch Daniels, George Bush, George W. Bush, Quayle, Rex Early. But probably my favorite person in your orbit is Mr. Devin Anderson.
Oh, my goodness.
Devin gave me my first job in politics in 1992 when I was working for your friend Jim Dora Sr. I was an undergraduate working at his hotel, and Dan Coates came to the Holiday Inn Airport, and he was senator. We all knew who Lugar was, but nobody knew who Coates was but me. And I went up to them and said, do you want a room just to kind of hang out? And so you're not here in the lobby. And that's the start of my friendship with Devin, which is, if I do the math, about 31 years old now. I think the world of him. And I just wanted to ask you, where would you be in life and business without Devin Anderson?
I would not be where I am today, that's for sure. He's been a great partner. And, we've worked together now off and on for 30 plus years. And we've been partners now for 12 years. And he ran 2 of our companies, and they were hugely successful. So I and my family benefited enormously from his hard work. And so No, he's. I love working with him.
Is there a special line item in the E&A budget for Harry and Izzy's?
He goes there all the time. Let me tell you. Yeah.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where he asks the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Al Hubbard, are you ready?
I'm ready.
What was your first job?
My first job, I was a camp counselor in high school.
What was your first concert?
Oh, my goodness. I don't know. We used to have a lot of concerts at Vanderbilt, and my favorite ones were the Four Tops, the Temptations, Diana Ross, Dionne Warwick. Let's see. Oh, we had what's his name? Otis Redding, the last night before he died, unfortunately. So those were, I've always been attracted to soul music, and we used to have those great singers in, and but I can't remember who the first one was.
Well, any of the above would be terrific for sure.
Absolutely.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Right now, I would, I'll tell you the books I've read recently that I loved. Bill Barr's books, extraordinary. You'll learn a lot of public policy. Tim Scott's book, which he was released in August, very short, tells you so much about the man. It's not really a political book. It's about life. It's about redemption. But it's a remarkable, it's very moving. And the book I'm reading now, which it's interesting. It's so different. It's Pompeo's just come out with a book, and it's spectacular. And you learn what Pompeo's like, and he is, he may be the guy I want to support for president. I mean, he's a tough son of a gun, and has a clear vision. And it's very different from what you would expect political book to be. He's very candid about what he thinks about people, and usually that's verboten, so to speak, because you're just going to offend people. But anyway, and of course, having worked at the CIA and then it's the State Department, as Secretary of State, it's fascinating. So I guess I'm talking about the recent books I've read. So the other ones I've loved. I mean, the Grant book. I've read that Roberts book on Churchill. I loved it too.
Oh, the Andrew Roberts book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Number 4. This is a toughie because I know you're a history buff. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh, my goodness. Well, you'd have to say you'd like to be there when Jesus
emerged.
Yeah, that would be number 1. But something more contemporary. I guess I'll never forget that. Oh, I can't remember the name of the movie. If I spent a little time, I could remember it. But at the end of World War II, when we won the surrender of Germany, I think that would have, or the surrender of Japan, but particularly the surrender of Germany. I don't know, to see Churchill do something. To be there for one of Churchill's great speeches.
The Iron Curtain speech, perhaps.
Oh yeah. Although the Iron Curtain speech. I was over here at that college in Missouri.
Westminster.
Mm-hmm. Westminster, yeah.
There's a great story of I'll send it to you on YouTube, of David Brinkley telling a story about how he was on the train with Roosevelt with Truman and Churchill going out there, and they were playing poker, and all the people were taking Churchill's money. And Churchill went to go to the bathroom, and while he was gone, Truman ordered all the journalists to let Churchill win. Said he saved Western Europe. We're not going to take his money.
Oh wow, that's a great story. I love it.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Assuming he's got to be 92 or 93 now, but I think he's still in great health. This is probably not who I would choose if I had plenty of time to think about it. I think I'd love to have 2 hours with Jim Baker.
Yeah.
Former
Chief of Staff, former Secretary of Treasury.
Right.
Won the Florida battle in 2000. Only he could have won that battle in 2000.
Yeah, that's right. So, I read the Peter Baker book, biography of him, not too long ago. It's a fabulous book. Well, this has been fun.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. And as always, our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been leader and legend, Al Hubbard. He's been very kind to me, both in my political life and my professional life. And he's a great person to have lunch with. If you can get on his calendar, you should do it. Thank you, Al, very much for your time.
Thanks for the kind invitation. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.